Thank you for joining us at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for today's online worship service. I'm Music Director Mark Vogel. The Reverend D. Scott Cooper, Assistant Minister of Congregational Life, is preaching this morning. He is joined by Worship Associate Connie Acosta, Membership and Communications Coordinator Alma Vizcara, and Tawana Grice, our Business Administrator. I am joined by our fantastic virtual choir this week. In today's message, Reverend Scott encourages us to not forget to take care of ourselves and one another while there are so many profound distractions and difficulties in the world. Some of you may be new to our congregation or to online services, so let us say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a faith community that believes we do not need to think alike to love alike, and that how we live our lives is ultimately more important than what we profess to believe. We are a faith community that recognizes the importance of fellowship and cooperation and advocates for an individual search for truth and meaning. We encourage and support spiritual growth within each one of us. Our Judeo-Christian roots have taught us the worth of each individual and the importance of justice and compassion. We respect other faith traditions because the divine is experienced in many ways. We appreciate the diversity of peoples because love is experienced in many ways. We honor the environment and all her creatures because our existence and experiences are inescapably interconnected and interwoven. We welcome you to our worship service this morning. We hope you find this time together to be a source of comfort and clarity. Thank you for joining us. We now invite you to hear our call to worship.
We gather together this Sunday morning once again. We gather to stop, pause, and to breathe and breathe again. This hour is set aside as special and sacred time for us to gather together in love and in community. Welcome you who join us virtually and spiritually while we are physically apart. We gather together to stop and pause from the events of the world that are so difficult to set aside. Yet we do so this hour to care for ourselves and one another. In this hour, we gather in community to set these burdens down, to pause, and to breathe again. In this hour, we reach out to others watching and join hearts, if not hands, and raise our voices in song one with another. Welcome, you who long for connection, you who long to set your burdens down. Come, let us worship together.
Celebremos compartiendo nuestras vidas, encendiendo esta luz. Unidos en el misterio de la hora, unidos ya en un gran cuerpo, unidos ya en la lucha triunfadora, Espíritu ven, unidos en el misterio de
Please join with me in the spirit that some call meditation and others name prayer. Make yourself comfortable, relax. Take one deep breath and then another. Open your mind, open your heart. Spirit of life and love, God of many names and mystery beyond all our naming. We come today, again, experiencing a world of emotions because of the state of the world. We often feel overwhelmed. We mourn because of loss of a sense of the life we once lived, a loss of familiarity and routine. In some cases, we mourn the loss of our employment or the loss of the health of a friend or loved one. We are sometimes even mourning the loss of the lives of friends and family members. But today, we name you as the Holy One, the Comforter, the one who knows of our sadness and loss, holds us in our grief and mourning, and hears our laments. Because we trust you to know and hear, we feel confident to move into hope, not blindly, not passively, but willing to learn the lessons of these crises, and knowing full well that we must join arm in arm with you and one another to accomplish the tasks that lie ahead, to move to a better way, a better world, not just for some, but for all. We pray in the names of all those known and unknown, present and absent, remembered and forgotten. We pray in the names of all helpers of humankind. May the congregation, absent in body, though present in spirit, say Amen. We pause now together to lift up that which sits heavy and light on our hearts. We lift up Jeff Scarda, who is undergoing surgery on Monday. We lift up him and Penny Serling in prayer. Our heart goes out to Sandy Boyd, who continues to have health challenges. And we are grateful that the surgery that Tara, the daughter of the Venerusos, underwent Friday was successful. We mourn with the family of civil rights hero John Lewis, a moral leader for decades. The good works of Representative Lewis will stand to prove that our influence and the repercussions of our actions can far outlive our physical bodies. I invite you now to say the name or bring to mind those you wish to be held by the loving embrace of this religious community. They are part of the great cloud of witness and memory, and we will, even if we do not know their names, hold them in our hearts. In this great cloud of witness and memory, amid this beloved community, we hear these names and hold them in our hearts. Let us remember the suffering and joy amid and among our community that we do not know. We pause in awe and wonder of the mystery that is life. In the spirit of love, in the spirit of hope, and in the spirit of compassion, I invite each of you to enter into a time of silent prayer, meditation, or reflection.
The Emergency Aid Coalition, the EAC, is changing lives hand in hand and is the recipient of our shared offering this week. EAC serves individuals and families who need food and clothing. As you might imagine, during the current health and economic crisis, many more people are now requesting assistance to meet their most basic needs. In 1983, First UU Church was a part of the Interfaith Coalition of member congregations that established the EAC, and we continue to provide financial support. We invite you to make your shared offering to help the EAC assist our neighbors who are now facing greater challenges. Thank you very much for your generous contribution.
Afterwards by Lynn Unger. She told her granddaughter the whole harrowing story, glossing over nothing. Not just the lives lost and the jobs, but also how it seemed like the world went dim when they lost dancing and singing, when the theaters and stadiums and concert halls closed down, when the school playground went silent. We never forgot, she assured the girl, what a hug feels like. We never stopped wanting that. But Grandma, the girl asked, how did you do it? How did you make it through? It wasn't easy, the woman replied, but at some point we decided we were more attached to living than to our old ideas about the way things were supposed to be.
The Pulse of Life, meditation by Jennifer Johnson. These are anxious days, hair-pulling, hair-wringing days. We are bombarded from all sides with new and unprecedented developments, grave threats to our national values and institutions on one hand, and countless calls to action on the other. And then the flood of critique and analysis. Whose strategy is winning? How do we outmaneuver the other side? These are indeed uncertain times. And yet, there are some things we do know for certain. We know that our blue boat home continues to rotate on its axis, continues its familiar sojourn around the sun. The sun sets and rises, and if we remember to pause, we may lose ourselves, but for a moment in the glorious play of light and color on the horizon. The Pulse of Life calls us to nourish our bodies with good food and movement, to nourish our spirits with art and song, friendship and tenderness and quiet. When we heed the pulse of life, we know what we need to do: to rise in the morning and rest into darkness, to put our hands, hearts, and minds to work, to meet those in our midst with compassion, to join with the vulnerable and speak truth to power, to play with our youngest and hear the wisdom of our elders, to heal the sick and wounded, to grieve the dying and remember the dead, to be of use and sometimes to be still. The pulse of life is beating in each and every one of us. Amidst the clamor of these times, let us heed its sure and steady rhythm.
These are anxious days, hair-pulling, hand-wringing days. We are bombarded from all sides with new and unprecedented developments, grave threats to our national values and institutions on one hand, and countless calls to action on the other. And then the flood of critique and analysis. Whose strategy is winning? How do we outmaneuver the other side? These are indeed uncertain times. These words from our second reading are by Jennifer Johnson, a recent graduate of Meadville Lombard Theological School, which many UU ministers have attended. Some of the things ministers try to do in a sermon are inform, inspire, and prompt action. And as we write our sermons, sometimes the emphasis shifts, and we change the title of the sermon, as I did today. Currently, in our world, there are many vital and pressing concerns and social justice issues vying for our attention. We have discussed several of them at length in previous sermons, and we've encouraged you to think about them and to take action. And there are plenty of reasons to seize the moment, as they say. I've heard these times described as a precipice of transformation. However, everything that is going on, whether directly related or not, is happening under the existential umbrella of the coronavirus and the ups and downs and stress that accompany a global pandemic. Someone called it the corona coaster. We would do well to remember that our primary task is to make sure our seatbelt is buckled and to keep our hands inside the car. We must take care of ourselves, followed closely by taking care of one another. Riding the corona coaster is much like a trip on an airplane. When the oxygen mask drops, put on yours before helping others on with theirs. And never have masks been more in our consciousness than now. Many have found this current situation overwhelming. There are times I certainly have, especially in the beginning. So I began wondering, how can we better deal with the stress of these times? How can members of our faith community support one another? And how can we incorporate our individual sense of that ultimate, unnameable, that some call the divine? The first thing we may need to address, it seems to me, is there seems a huge difference in the way we spend our time. And really, what is our life but the way we spend our time? Annie Dillard, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of narrative prose, wrote, "How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. What we do with this hour and that one is what we are doing." How we spend our time has changed for nearly everyone. Our lives have changed, and change often creates anxiety. Some find they have more extra time than ever. For instance, some who are retired are unable to enjoy the outings and activities with friends they once enjoyed, and are stuck at home with time on their hands. Some who are working from home are finding the time they need to spend commuting and traveling for work is now free for them. Others, however, are more frantically busy than ever. Parents working from home, trying to wrangle their work schedules and Zoom calls with kids' schoolwork, meals, snacks, and claims of boredom. But in either case, nearly everyone is wondering whether they are spending their time wisely and effectively. Advice bombards us from all sides, telling us how to make the most of the situation, how to not waste a good crisis, in the words of one blogger. Even if another person in our social bubble or quarantine pod is not demanding our time and attention, social media and news magazine TV shows tell us that now is our time to learn a new language, lose 20 pounds, or write the great American novel. That adds even more pressure than what we already had just adjusting to this new way of life. I'm here to encourage you, or give you permission if you think you need it to pause. When it gets overwhelming, or if you are able to plan and set aside a time for it, slow down and breathe. Stop and breathe. Breathe again, then breathe some more. Let the stress flow out of you, perhaps out the bottoms of your feet, and ground yourself in the present moment. No one is expecting any of us to be strong and busy all the time. And if they are, don't listen to them. Once you've gotten used to doing this for a time, the next time your body tells you that you need to chill, extend the time that you do it. I read a phrase I like, unplug judiciously. We shouldn't sequester from the world indefinitely to get away from it. That's not wise or productive. But we must unplug sometimes to recenter and recharge. If you're lucky enough to have a backyard or park near your home, take time there to take a break. Maybe that's why the American Heart Association says those with a dog live longer. They have to stop what they're doing when the dog is whining at the door and go outside for a while. I don't have a dog, but there's no reason I can't don one of my stylish masks and walk around the park. But some days, I do well to venture out onto my balcony. Perhaps you see where this is going. No matter who you are or how busy we are, it's often difficult to take time for ourselves, and even harder to make time to devote to a spiritual life of some sort. We, as Unitarian Universalists, know this looks different for everyone. Just as we recognize there is wisdom in many faith traditions, we recognize there are myriad ways to commune with our understanding of the divine. There is no end to the things we might do to center us, ground us in the present, and to tap into what gives our life meaning. More traditional methods include prayer or meditation, ways of slowing down, centering, breathing, and connecting. I know many of you do yoga or Tai Chi. I suppose you can do it with a video until classes resume. Some of you are creative and write songs or poems or journal. Some create visual art or sculpture or pottery. It's easy to not make time for these things that recenter, recharge, and feed our souls. But it is easy to do things that masquerade as those things, like too much food and drink, or TV, or any number of emotion-numbing activities. But it's vitally important. The way we spend our time is the way we spend our lives. By the way, there's more to the quote of Annie Dillard's that I shared with you. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. What we do with this hour and that one is what we are doing. A schedule defends from chaos and whim. It is a net for catching days. A net for catching days. This reminds me of a recommendation we learned on the first of my ministers' forums. Family therapist Conrad Hamrick was asked for ways to help our kids through this tough time. One of his suggestions was to recommend that we have a schedule for our children, perhaps even post it on the wall. A little bit of structure can go a long way when we're all in the house all day, when our schedules can be loose to the point of falling apart. But a schedule defends from chaos and whim. And having children in the house is not a prerequisite for doing this. Even before the pandemic, when more people were just beginning to work from home, I heard of folks who stuck to their routine. They set their alarm, they got up and showered, got dressed, ate breakfast, and only then sat down to work. Some even drove around the block to truly distinguish between work time and free time. Setting aside specific times, work time, family time, sacred time for ourselves and our spirit, approaching our time with intentionality, not allowing the different aspects of our life to flow together and to randomly sink and rise in importance like some sort of temporal lava lamp. These are acts or series of acts that are regularly repeated in a set or precise manner, which Merriam-Webster tells us is one of the definitions of ritual. Many of us think of the first definition, of or relating to rites or a ceremony. And one of the reasons we are having to backfill our lives with ritual is because rituals have been taken from us. The steady rhythms of our lives, the assumed occurrences and places. Not only the familiar place of school, high school graduations and proms were canceled. The commute to work each day, a typical lunch with coworkers or clients, and canceled business trips. The weekly outing or standing dinner date, postponed or relegated to Zoom. Those regularly repeated acts that gave our days and weeks a rhythm. And of course, we miss the people and places where those things took place. Friends at school whom we don't see in person. Walking into the school with the familiar feel and smell we expect. Our favorite server at a great little restaurant we know about. The comfortable familiarity of your office or cubicle. The unique look and feel of a relative's house when you go to visit. Which brings up how we miss the sense of touch, being able to hug a relative or friend or school chum or friends at church without so much as a second thought. We never forgot, she assured the girl, what a hug feels like. We never stopped wanting that. Of course, we often think of church when we think of ritual. We miss coming into the sacred space of the sanctuary, the welcoming vibe and smell of coffee in the fellowship hall, the friendly feel of a meeting room. We miss the very real rituals of the bell calling us to worship, the lighting of the chalice, prayers and responses and hymns and choral anthems. But we also miss those very important rituals that aren't weekly and aren't necessarily at church. Like someone's prom or graduation, they are typically once-in-a-lifetime events. Weddings postponed or moved to Zoom. Memorial services postponed indefinitely. These are all the very real and meaningful rituals of our lives that we are mourning because we no longer have them, at least for now. All the more reason that we need to and must take time for ourselves, stop and breathe, and move into personal rituals that give our lives meaning and connect us to one another and to the ultimate. In this past week's Ministers Forum, I talked to Dr. Jaretta Marshall, a professor of pastoral care, and we talked about how we are definitely mourning, even if we haven't lost our job or don't personally know someone who is sick or has died. We are mourning all the things I've talked about that have been taken from us. We talked about 4 things we need during these difficult times: creativity, resiliency, hope, and lament. She explained how hope and lament are intertwined, which reminds me of a William Blake poem I sometimes read at memorial services. Joy and woe are woven fine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. It is right it should be so. We were made for joy and woe. But of course, we don't want the unpleasant feelings. People, especially Americans, just want the good feelings. And I think this is part of what has got us in this unique and scary situation, leading the world in new coronavirus cases and deaths. We don't want to admit we're vulnerable. We want to go to the beach and the bars and restaurants and never wear a mask because bad things happen to other people. And besides, nobody tells us what to do. We want to pretend things are just fine and normal, despite evidence to the contrary. In a wildly popular TED Talk from 10 years ago, Houston professor and researcher Brené Brown talked about vulnerability. This is the world we live in. We live in a vulnerable world. And one of the ways we deal with it is we numb vulnerability. And I think there's evidence. We are the most in-debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in U.S. history. The problem is, and I learned this from the research, that you cannot selectively numb emotion. You can't say, here's the bad stuff, here's vulnerability, here's grief, here's shame, here's fear, here's disappointment. I don't want to feel these. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana muffin. You can't numb those hard feelings without numbing the other affects, our emotions. You can't selectively numb. So when we numb those, we numb joy, we numb gratitude, we numb happiness. And then we are miserable, and we are looking for purpose and meaning. So then we have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin, and it becomes this dangerous cycle. So, we must deal with the bad to progress toward the good. Work through the unpleasant emotions if we want to really feel the good ones, if we're going to grow toward purpose and meaning. If we want to walk toward hope, we have to address and name our laments. Dr. Marshall said it better than I. Lament and hope are deeply intertwined because as we name what is wrong in the world, at the moment, in whatever way we name it, a really good lament also helps us think about what is it that we want to have into the future? What's the hope? And why do we think there is something to hope in or someone to have faith in? So we're always connecting this kind of sadness and grief and loss and lament with this turn toward hope and resiliency and creativity. Mourning the loss of our old normal, the way it is supposed to be, then being willing to name our sorrow and grief because of it. And being willing to be vulnerable during this time allows us to look with hope toward the future. But Grandma, the girl asked, how did you do it? How did you make it through? It wasn't easy, the woman replied. But at some point we decided we were more attached to living than to our old ideas about the way things were supposed to be. Amen, and may it be so.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
We close with the words of Representative John Lewis. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Do not become bitter or hostile. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. We will find a way to make a way out of no way. Amen. And go in peace and go in hope.
While our church as buildings is closed, our church as people is still meeting, but now online. There are weekly and monthly offerings to keep you connected and engaged with our community. Please join Reverend Scott this morning for reflection and sharing via Zoom at 11:30. The Creative Writing Group meets today at 2. The group welcomes a full range of artistic expression from the traditional to the experimental. Join Reverend Colin on Tuesday to discuss Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Reverend Scott on Thursday as he continues his discussion of A House for Hope, the promise of progressive religion for the 21st century. Please go to our website, firstuuhouston.org/online-group-meetings for more details, and remember, all times shown are Central Daylight Time.